Module 9, the peripheral nervous system. Control of the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is comprised of two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. You just learned what those two divisions are responsible for. But in many areas of the body, these divisions work opposite to one another. So how does your body know which division to stimulate? What controls the autonomic nervous system? Well, I need to introduce something called autonomic reflexes. Last module, you learned about reflex arcs, which control reflexes in the skeletal muscles without having to wait for action potentials to travel to the brain and back. The sensory afferent neuron sends action potentials to an association neuron in the spinal cord. That association neuron can send a signal to an efferent neuron to cause a skeletal muscle to contract. Well, autonomic reflexes behave pretty much the same way. A sensory afferent neuron sends information to an association neuron. This neuron interprets the information in the same way the one in the reflex arc does. Then, if a function needs to be stimulated, either the sympathetic or parasympathetic division will be stimulated, based on what needs to occur. It kind of behaves this way. If your blood pressure rises too much, it needs to be lowered. But if it decreases too much, it has to be raised. Well, there are receptors near the big arteries next to the heart. They can identify blood pressure changes, sending that information to the medulla oblongata. If there is an increase in blood pressure, association neurons within the medulla will activate the parasympathetic neurons, which will send action potentials to decrease blood pressure. And if the receptors identify a decrease in blood pressure, then the association neurons in the medulla activate other association neurons, which activate the sympathetic division neurons in the spinal cord. These then send action potentials to increase blood pressure. That pathway is an autonomic reflex. Now you need to know that the sensory neurons and association neurons are not a part of the autonomic nervous system. Just the efferent neurons of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are. Now in reality, there's more happening here. There are systems that are in place to make sure this process occurs efficiently, especially when we're talking about critical functions such as blood pressure. The autonomic reflex is a negative feedback, with the stimulus causing an opposite effect from the initial event. So there are additional sympathetic neurons innervating blood vessels throughout the body. If the blood pressure is too low, the parasympathetic neurons continually send action potentials to the blood vessels, so they are partially constricted. That way, blood pressure becomes more increased. But if the blood pressure is too high, the sympathetic division reduces the frequency of the action potentials, dilating the vessels and lowering blood pressure. The autonomic reflexes are controlled in many areas of the central nervous system, such as the medulla, the spinal cord, and the hypothalamus. When they become stimulated, they begin the signaling process. The stimuli can come directly from sensory neurons coming into the association neurons, or they can come from other areas of the central nervous system. A good example of another area of the central nervous system affecting the autonomic nervous system is when the limbic system in the brain recognizes emotional information like fear. If fear is identified, then the limbic system stimulates the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, which will increase your heart rate as well as add glucose to the bloodstream and get the adrenal glands to release hormones. That way you can be ready for whatever action you need to take. Remember, this is called a fight or flight response.